We're in the north of England on some of our favourite roads, favourite photographic locations, and we've brought together 3 iconic Japanese modern classics. So we have a Subaru Impreza 22B, we have a Lexus LFA, and we have a Nismo R35 GT-R. They represent very different sides of Japanese car culture. There's nothing like them. It's the best way to describe it. There's nothing else like it.
Japanese performance cars kind of as a whole have almost built up this almost mythical status in that they do things so differently from European car makers and US car makers. They're kind of their own unique thing. So part of the reason we've pulled this test together is to kind of celebrate what makes them special and have 3 of the very, in our opinion, greatest Japanese performance cars ever made. Narrowing down our choice of cars was pretty hard, actually. We've arrived at those 3. I think they represent very different sides of Japanese car culture, really. So obviously the Impreza is an absolute rallying legend, and it's not anymore, but the more affordable, relatable car. The Subaru and Mitsubishi Evo wars were a kind of a defining part of the automotive world, I guess, at the end of the 90s, start of the noughties, but it feels like the Subaru's grown into maybe more of an icon. At the other end of the scale, we've got a money no object clean sheet supercar, which was the Lexus LFA. The LFA has developed this reputation as a bit of a unicorn. It's a kind of a moment in time and a car that will probably never be repeated. And in between those 2 is probably the most iconic of all Japanese performance cars. That's the GT-R. It's been around for decades, but the R35 has kind of been the peak of that because it's influenced so many other performance cars from other countries as well. It's quite literally changed the face of cars. 22B is very close to Evo's heart, partly because it was in the very first issue, but I think it's the poster car for that era of Impreza and also of the Mitsubishi Evos. We were always comparing those cars, and the 22B was the ultimate Impreza, really. I can't stop smiling in this. It just takes me right back to the 90s. So obviously predating 22B, but I spent so much time in Impreza turbos and STIs, and they were just such joyful things. I'm a child of the 90s, and the Impreza was such an important kind of part of the car world for me growing up. You know, Colin McRae was the hero of world rallying, and Colin McRae Rally was the game on the PlayStation 1 that we were all playing at that time, and the Gran Turismo game was huge. And then the 22B is the ultimate example of the classic Impreza genre. There's so much of this car, it's not that I'd forgotten, but you just glance in the mirror and you see that big wing sat there obscuring your view, and you always had to do that to see what was behind you. Obviously the big scoop in the bonnet, which is a really iconic design feature of all the turbocharged Imprezas, and perhaps best of all, in the door mirror you just get that big blistered arch. I think the 22B always had some style quality about it, didn't it? And it was peak pro-drive, peak Subaru. It was the ultimate in every regard, and the end of an era, really, because rallying changed quite soon after, so it was just all of the good stuff kind of put into one of our favourite cars.
Oh, it is quick. I'm not going anywhere near the red line, and just the urge, the pull in the mid-range is so strong. It feels so nimble, it feels up on its toes and ready to dance. It doesn't feel inert at all, it feels kind of alive and communicative. I'm starting to understand why this model is so revered.
Yeah, it really is every bit as special as I thought it would be. It feels a lot faster than I thought it would. That engine really likes to rev. It's got so much more flexibility and kind of potency than a regular Impreza engine.
These cars have so much energy, and the 22B, it's a big ball of energy. It's boosty, but it's tractable, it's revvy, but you don't need to rev it. It kind of has an answer for whatever road you're on and whatever mood you're in and whatever speed you want to carry. It just seems to revel in the road. I think of all the cars we've got here, GT-R is the one that stands for the most. I guess it's got the most history. This is kind of last of the line, really, which makes me sad. It was like nothing else when it came out, and it's stuck to that very rigidly to that formula. It's improved, but it hasn't really evolved.
Even though the ride's really firm, the quality of the movement is so good. The body is so well controlled, and it feels like it just changes direction so well too.
The R35 generation GT-R came out so long ago, all the way back in 2007, and it's really unusual for a car to stay at the top the way it has. When it first arrived on the scene, it was so different from everything, because here was this very big, very heavy car that could turn in these incredible lap times around the Nürburgring. And I think it really changed the course of how other car manufacturers approach things.
Such a totally different character, this car, to the other two. It's a big brute of a thing, but I kind of dig that. I think Japanese cars have always polarised opinion a little bit. I think GT-R more than most, I guess because it challenged the established sort of European heroes for one, so that put some people's noses out of joint, so they dislike the car on principle almost.
In some ways, the GT-R is kind of the antithesis to what Evo stands for, because it's quite heavy, it's quite complicated, it's so fast that you could argue if you really dug in with it, it would be too fast for the road. And it has perhaps accelerated this technology arms races with cars where they've all become more complex than they were before, and maybe some people look at the numbers and try and think of it as a car, as a target to beat. But then you drive it.
You have to drive it to understand what they're about. It really does drive how it looks, big, muscly, square-shouldered thing, just a proper nightclub bouncer of a car, I think.
It's quite brutal in some ways, but it's also very pointy, quite delicate. You almost drive it like a sort of big Mitsubishi Evo or something. It's a really unique thing.
It takes a lot to make something like a 911 Turbo S feel a bit soft, but yeah, GT-R is just next level stuff for aggression and focus, and just bludgeoning its way down the road. I think that's the only way you can describe it.
I think it's a car where you have to drive it to understand it, and until you've driven one, you're never quite... I didn't get it until I drove one, and I'm a big fan now.
I think whenever you mention or talk about the Lexus LFA, you're immediately drawn to the engine and the famous exhaust note, and it is a spectacular engine. There's nothing quite like it, actually. Certainly it's completely different to any of the other V10s you might think of, and that would be enough for most cars. But I think the more time you spend with the LFA, the more you find that actually the engine is just a small part of what is a really extraordinary car.
I've got a 1.3 V10, I've got a quiet road. Let's go.
I think it sounds maybe even more exciting outside the car than in it. It's a pretty special noise. There's a lot of kind of induction as well as exhaust noise, but from the outside it sounds like this sort of weird experimental prototype that shouldn't be on the road.
We're just over 3,000 RPM and it already sounds like it's in the stratosphere, and it revs all the way to 9, so God knows what it's going to sound like up there at 9.
There's the famous story about them having to have a digital rev counter because supposedly an analog needle couldn't keep up with the engine. And the revs just go up and up and up. You get to about 4.5 and it already feels quite intense, and then you realise you're only about halfway there. There's so much headroom in it.
It's a real engineer's car. You can feel every single bit of the car has been obsessed over and had fortunes spent on it because it only went into this car. That's the crazy thing about it. It's a complete one-off. The things that make the LFA stand out, it's just the way the car feels so highly developed and honed, and they've spent such a long time sweating all the details in a way that only really Japanese manufacturers seem to do. I love the way this car goes down the road. It's just got such a focus and a sense of purpose and that kind of supercar feel, and yet you're sat back comfortably. It rides pretty well, it steers really nicely and accurately, the brake pedal is right there, no slack. It's so easy to drive smoothly and slowly, which is often a bigger test of a car actually, where you might expect it to be a little bit intimidating or not give you quite the feel you want, or wherever you go with it, it always seems to work. It just has this brilliant balance and it's approachable and it's feelsome, and the harder you drive it the better it gets, so you can drive it harder and harder and harder and harder, and it just seems to up its game. This V10 engine is so exciting, it sounds brilliant, it just has such sharpness, and that wail is quite unlike anything else, even a Carrera GT, which is the obvious thing to compare it with. You're immediately drawn to the engine and the famous exhaust note, and it is a spectacular engine. There's nothing quite like it actually. Certainly it's completely different to any of the other V10s you might think of, so the Audi or Lamborghini, and that would be enough for most cars, but I think the more time you spend with the LFA, the more you find that the engine is just a small part of a really extraordinary car. It's not massively powerful, certainly not massively powerful in 2024, but what it has, you feel like you can use, you can access, and that is worth more than another 200 horsepower.
We forget how fast cars have become because it didn't feel that quick. Obviously it's a very fast car, but in the context of 2024 it didn't feel supercar fast, but it had way more character than so many of the supercars on sale today.
Just the nuance in the engine, the difference between putting it under load at 4,000 revs and really winding it up to 8 or 9. It is like two completely different cars.
So I think the GT-R developed this reputation, perhaps unfairly, as a car that kind of drives itself, that's kind of technology first and driver second, but to drive it, it actually feels weirdly, it's almost agricultural in some ways. It's a totally analog feeling car actually, it feels anything but digital.
It's such a techie car, but it feels really mechanical. There's this kind of urban myth that the GT-R is a digital car, but it's not really like anything else. It's its own unique feel. It's a unique experience in the car world.
I'd forgotten how, at times, quite crude this gearbox sounds. There's all sorts of chunters and clunks and clonks, and you don't expect a paddle shift double clutch box to give you that sense of it working away, but that's all part of this R35 experience. I think technology plays a big part in the car, and it's paddle shift and it's all-wheel drive and it's got all this funky kind of four-wheel steer, and so it places certainly when you read a description of the car, it's heavily reliant on what underpins it, either electronics or hardware, but actually the driving experience is quite pure. You don't really feel a lot of this crazy stuff going on beneath you. All it seems to do is pull enormous amounts of grip out of the road surface and deal with bumps and lumps. It almost happens too quickly for you to separate out how it's doing it. I think it's a fascinating thing to drive and a massive thrill.
The acceleration is on another plane to the Lexus. You can feel it's got so much more torque, so much more power, so much more performance on tap. It's a different kind of car, doing a different kind of thing, but it's equally addictive in its own way.
There aren't many other cars, I think, that could cover ground from point to point as fast as this thing can. So it's quite a unique kind of reign at the top it's had for so long. But its limits are so high compared with, say, the 22B and the LFA to a lesser extent. To actually kind of drive it at the limit, you are going very, very quick. So it's a different proposition from those cars.
The 22B, it's just appropriate for fast road driving in a way. Big heavy cars of today, they're very capable and very impressive, but they don't give you as much road to work with, and they need so much technology to make them work. And I think I'd forgotten how old school these cars are. I can't remember the last time I drove a 5-speed stick shift, and it feels so small and it feels so light.
There's so much feel and feedback kind of flowing through it. It's also quite nice that it's narrower than the other two cars on the test, so you can kind of pick your own line through a corner more easily on the type of roads we've been driving on.
This car is so quick, honestly. I'm barely using any throttle, and it is so eager, it boosts so easily. You can feel how light it is as well. It does not feel like a heavy car at all. It must be the lightest car of these three by some margin. Embarrassingly, I don't remember the curb weights for these cars off the top of my head, but this feels so much lighter than the other two. No worries at all going through the puddles. You know, in the LFA I was being pretty ginger through the puddles, but in this car, I mean, it's what it's built for, isn't it?
The LFA was already scarily expensive when it was new, and now today it's even more terrifyingly expensive because values are climbing north of £1 million now. That almost colours your judgment of the car before you drive it, I suppose. I guess I was expecting it to be mind-alteringly, life-changingly brilliant, and the first few miles in the car, it didn't blow me away the way I thought it would. The gear change feels so slow. It's you know, single clutch. Actually, the first thing I did in it was I pulled out of a T-junction and did a kind of nodding dog impression as it changed gear so slowly.
In every other respect, I think it's even more impressive because as time has gone on, engines have become slightly less raw, slightly less physical, slightly less expressive, and that really comes through in the car.
The more time I've spent with it, the more it kind of got under my skin, and I think it definitely deserves this status it's grown into as a kind of legendary car because it is so unique.
It manages to combine that kind of supercar edge with GT comfort and looks like nothing else. It feels like nothing else, and no one else has really even tried to combine the qualities that the LFA has. You don't really think of the Japanese as being builders of truly exotic cars, but the LFA really confounds that notion. The Lexus always seemed quite an expensive car at the time, I think because there was a disconnect between what you expect from a Lexus and what the car actually delivered. But now I think it's much easier to see the LFA for what it is and the enormous amount of investment that went into it. I don't think they certainly Toyota lost a fortune on every car they built. They built 500 in 2 years. They've never built anything like it before, never built anything like it since, probably never will be anything like it again. Whenever I'm near an LFA, I'm always slightly in awe of the thing. I love the Jekyll and Hyde nature of it. It's on the one hand, it's like ultra Lexus. Everything is super luxury and super high quality. All the switches and the trim and the hi-fi, and you've got every creature comfort you could wish for, and yet you can feel the structural rigidity in the car, the way it goes down the road, and you've always got this really feral V10. It's actually not that refined. It's quite noisy. The engine is it's very present in the car. It's not isolated as you might expect. So it is a very weird, hard to pin down combination of cars. you don't really know what to expect the first time you drive it. And even when you've spent a full day in it, you get out and you're still slightly bemused by the way it goes about what it does.
I would have happily just driven it and driven it and driven it for days and days and days. I never really wanted to stop driving it, which in this job you don't always get.
I love the attention to detail. It sounds really weird saying how much you love an indicator stalk or a wiper stalk, but these things are just like beautifully sculpted chopsticks almost. It's consistent throughout the whole car. The GT-R kind of had some history and legacy cars to draw from and try and beat. You come to the car knowing like the GT-R name means a lot, and it's a bit like coming to a Ferrari or something, I suppose. There's a lot of history there. I love the fact this is a Nismo. I love all the history surrounding Nismo and its competition pedigree and the Amori factory in Tokyo. And if you're fascinated by that, then it just adds an extra layer of appeal for this car. I think the infotainment display, like any car of a certain age, it feels quite old, looks quite old, but I love the fact that it was designed, or the graphics were designed by the same people that did Gran Turismo. I think that's a real nod to wider car culture. And Gran Turismo was certainly my first exposure to the GT-R, so I think it's really extra cool that Nismo have made that acknowledgement to the game, and that the two kind of cross over so perfectly. I remember we were trying to put the content list for the first issue of Evo together, and right at that point the 22B was probably the hottest car in the world, really. Everyone was going mad for it, but it was only a Japanese market car at that point. Not many of them had been released, and we heard through the grapevine that a car was coming to the UK, and we made contact with the owner, and he was very generous and keen for us to try it. So there was always a race to get the next new Impreza or the next new Evo at that point, and there was a bit of a competition between us, Autocar, Performance Car when we were there, and Car Magazine. So yeah, the 22B was on our list, and when we got it, I think we knew we'd achieved something that people were going to notice with that car. I love how simple it is, how small it is. I mean, it's very cheap and plasticky really inside, which they always were, but you always had to look beyond your surroundings and just soak in the driving experience.
One of the things that people immediately associate with the 22B is that sort of wide arches look and that rear wing, and you feel that when you're in the car as well, as apart from seeing it on the outside. Ahead of you, you've got that kind of letterbox scoop on the front bonnet. You look in the rearview mirror and you can see that big hooped rear wing.
It's just so characterful and evocative of a really great time. Great time for cars, great time for rallying. Yeah, I miss these cars. I miss them a lot. And the 22B was always the daddy as soon as they launched it. It looked so good, so good.
It's a kind of a Goldilocks car because it's really fast without being irresponsibly fast for the road. It's really grippy, but you can still play with the balance and move the car around. The steering's kind of really light and yet somehow has loads of feel. I don't quite know how they do that. The ride's pretty firm and tied down, but it soaks up the bumps really well on these roads. You probably wouldn't want to do it now given the car's value the way they've gone, but you could drive it into town and park it outside co-op and it would be fine. It's still a usable car that you could drive all the time. Yeah, it's the type of car that doesn't exist anymore and we're kind of poorer for it, I think.
Showier cars and there are faster cars and more track focused cars, and And yeah, there are better cars now. You know, time has caught up with the LFA, certainly where the gearbox is concerned, but are there cooler and more interesting cars? I don't know, I'm struggling to think of one. Yeah, okay, £1 million for a Lexus, possibly more than £1 million now, I don't know. It seems nuts, but to be around this car, to see its construction and to understand its character and to extend this amazing engine, right now it feels like it would be worth every penny.
Yeah, I think everybody wonders what it would be like to drive, and the really nice thing that's come out of this test is it wasn't a disappointment. It wasn't a don't meet your heroes moment, because it's every bit as weird and wonderful as its reputation suggests.
I would love to own one of these things, but I could never own one of these things because you just want to drive it so fast. And it's capable of driving so fast.
It is so fast, so much quicker than the other two cars here. I mean, they're both very, very fast cars, the 22B and the LFA, but the GT-R was so much quicker than both of them. Weirdly, on top of that, there is this weird kind of delicate feel to it as well. The steering is quite pointy, it's so responsive, and you can move it around on weight transfer like you can with much smaller, lighter cars. It feels way lighter than it really is.
It's not all about going flat out. It is a special thing and an exciting, proper occasion at whatever speed, just sitting in it, just looking at it. But as soon as you're in it and the engine started, you just start to grow horns, and yeah, it's very hard to resist.
So if I was challenged to sum up the 22B in one word, I'll go with sweet, because it's kind of the sweet spot. It feels, yeah, just the right level of performance, of grip, of visibility, of the dimensions of the car. It kind of feels just right for these roads and just right for 2024, ironically.
The problem with driving this car is I immediately want an Impreza Turbo again. I can only dream of a 22B, but although all the others have become more collectible, they're kind of in reach, and I do love the idea of spending time with one of these cars. What a fantastic car. I think initially when you bring a car like this to the test, you know it's fabulous, but when it's up against an LFA or a GT-R, they're very, very, very big league machines, and this comes from quite humble stock, but I really shouldn't have worried because it's every bit as special, and certainly on the roads we're driving today, I think it's definitely the weapon of choice.
If I could choose, I would take the LFA, just because it's such a special car, and I still feel like I'm discovering things about it. Every time I drive it, I feel like I discover something new, and it's just this weird, incredible car that will never be repeated. So to spend time with it feels like such a privilege.
I love them all. I have more fun more of the time in the 22B. So if I could take it home and keep one, that would be the one. I love them, and I love the LFA in particular because of all the things James has said. And it gets better and better the more you drive it. But there'd still be more occasions where I'd just jump in the Subaru and even onto the shops or something in it.
To have had these three cars together for 3 whole days, I feel very, very lucky. Not many people have had the chance to drive one of these cars, let alone all 3 together. So if I had to sum up the GT-R Nismo in a single word, I'd probably go with brutal, because it looks pretty brutal, but that also translates to how it drives. It kind of almost pummels the road into submission in a way.
It's just no compromise, absolute maximum attack kind of car. Even when you're not driving it hard, it's telling you it wants to be driven hard. So it's full on.
The Lexus LFA, it's another car that you want to keep driving and discovering, and it never really stops rewarding you.
It always surprises you. It's never quite what you think it's going to be. It's a sort of monument to Toyota's will to make something completely unique. And it always was that, and it always will be that.
Everyone calls it a unicorn, don't they? I guess that's the word I keep coming back to. It's got this sort of weird living legend status.
I think the 22B, it's just endless fun. Whenever you get in the car, you have a massive smile on your face. You get out of the car still with a massive smile on your face. It's just completely infectious.
I think we've been very lucky to have lived in a time when all these cars have been around, but it also makes me feel a little bit melancholy because I don't know if we're going to have cars like this again.